Welcome to Coffee Cups and Flying Saucers. I'm Maria Tellier. I'm the State Director for New Mexico for the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON. I have a presentation on the third Saturday of every month at 11 a.m. at Otero Arts in Alamogordo, New Mexico. I always present something that is New Mexico related so that we can all relate to it. And I also wanted to let everyone know that this year I will have a table, MUFON will have a table at the UFO Museum in Roswell during the ufologist invasion, and that would be July 3rd, 4th, and 5th. I will be in the lobby and I hope you could stop by and say hi if you go to the Roswell Festival. I highly recommend it. Every April, I talk about the Holloman Landing, the famous Holloman Landing in 1964. This year, I've done a significant amount of research regarding the vetting of evidence, my evidence and everyone else's evidence. And I'm bringing you my results today. And I just want to remind everybody the vetting is actually proving the evidence to be true, finding facts and analysis to back up your statement. And that's what I am going to do today. I am going to back up my statement before stating it as true fact. Basic summary of the Holloman landing is that there were landings of unidentified craft on April 30th, 1964. One object landed at White Sands Missile Range, which I'm going to refer to as WSMR from now on, and the other one was at Holloman Air Force Base. They were two similar but different objects that landed at a similar time in both locations. Actually, the object that landed at Holloman had multiple witness accounts of occupants leaving that craft. The craft that left The occupants that left the craft actually carried a staff, which was identified as a translator, and they used that translator to communicate with the Holloman base commander and chief scientist, and some others that were there also, but primarily the base commander and the chief scientist. That after communicating, they were taken to Building 930 on Holloman, and their craft was moved to Building 830. And all of this was being recorded by Holloman base personnel. So, what evidence do I have to prove this? That there was a landing of two objects that day, one at Wismer and one at Holloman. How do I prove that they were similar but they were separate at those locations? Also, I made positive identification of the Holloman base commander, and it was very hard for me to prove that he was the base commander. I want to know why that was so hard. And, also I state that Holloman leadership and the occupants had a communication between each other, and that this whole incident was recorded. This was recorded in history. And what proof do I have that happened? And also that their craft was unloaded. The craft was unloaded on base, and where did that happen on base? And again, we're going to go back to that April 30th, 1964, and why I am so very sure that that is the date of the Holloman landing. But first, there was a landing at Stallion Gate, North Range, Wismer. Okay, that is up by Route 380. It's on the north range of White Sands Missile Range, and it's closer to the town of San Antonio, New Mexico, than it is to Alamogordo, New Mexico. And the leading UFO reporting agency of their time, APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, they were in the area investigating the recent Socorro landing. There had been a landing of a craft in Socorro, New Mexico on April 23rd. Uh, APRO was there like the next day, boots on the ground, investigating that case. The town was flooded with reporters and investigators. just for a few days. They lost interest pretty quickly, but APRO stayed to check their evidence and to follow up on all their leads. So they were still in town on April 30th, which was Thursday, when they got a call from a contact that was working at White Sands Missile Range, Stallion Gate. An eyewitness said that there were multiple witnesses to objects flying in their airspace. Evidence of that was being picked up on their radars and also their SPS-16 radar caught them on radar. And that's a different kind of radar. That's a radar that actually follows the object. Standard radar, just when an object flies into their range, it shows up as blips on the radar, but the FPS-16 radar actually follows the objects as it flies through their range for the range of their scope. It also records the entire transaction digitally, which digitally was a new thing back then in 1964. It records the azimuth, the altitude, and the speed that the object is moving at. And the FPS-16 at White Sands Missile Range, Stallion Gate, was recording that morning. Also, the civilians and military who were working on that base were all talking about it. It was common knowledge, and more importantly, it was not classified. So when the contact picked up the phone and called Carl Lorenzen of APRO, he wasn't violating any non-disclosures that he had. It was common knowledge and it was not classified. Now, APRO recorded in their APRO bulletin, their May bulletin was devoted mostly to the Socorro landing. They had that bulletin out 2 weeks after that happened, but they noted in the May bulletin that in July they were going to have an extensive articles and reviews regarding the landings at the military base on April 30th. So that was what they reported in the July APRO bulletin. So I want to continue with what else happened up there. There was a range radio network transmission. And on this slide, I have the dialogue that was overheard of a B-57 pilot talking to the White Sands Tower, the tower that was up there at Stallion Gate. The employees were overhearing this, and again, when the Lorenzens contact called them, they told them this is what we heard, what was going on. It's what we saw. We saw the white object, and Carl Lorenzen, jotted all that down, and she called her buddy in town, her her former APRO contact. The Lorenzens had lived in Alamogordo from 54 to 60. They ran APRO out of Alamogordo, and they had many contacts and they had many volunteers. And the one was Terry Clark from radio station KALG. He was a former APRO volunteer, and they remained good friends. She called Terry Clark to give him this tip about the object up in the White Sands airspace, and Terry Clark already knew about it. He was actually surprised that she knew about it because he had a friend of his who was a ham radio operator call him already and give him the same dialogue. So what Carl Lorenzen had is she had information from two separate locations from two separate witnesses of the same transmission that was overheard. So I'm very, very confident that there was a landing up at Wismar on the morning of April 30th, 1964. Now, I really wanted to prove that. I wanted to bring you guys evidence of that. And in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, there is a facility called the National UFO Historical Records Center. It's run by a gentleman named Dave Marler. Fantastic guy, very helpful. He has the entire APRO collection of case files and evidence at that facility. It's like 17 filing cabinets, 4-drawer filing cabinets, just chock full of the APRO case files, the originals, all the original evidence. I drove up there looking for this case file because I wanted that actual radar evidence and the names of the individuals that Mrs. Lorenzen spoke to. I drove up to the facility and Dave Marlar helped me for hours. We looked for those files. Those files are in very meticulous, organized order. The April 30th, 1964 file was not there. It was gone. And I was unable to verify the information that I wanted to verify with you today. But even though we still had two witnesses in two different locations that discussed the same event. So I'm quite confident that there was a landing at Wismar that day. And on this slide, you're going to see names, locations, and references related to now the Holloman landing that we're going to discuss. I want to present my evidence to support that. And, I just said that there was a landing at White Sands that was reported in April. But this is known as the Holloman Landing. How did it go from being a landing at White Sands to being the Holloman Landing? All the HAPRO evidence fully supports a landing at White Sands, but they didn't have anything in there except for they had a slight notation that there was radar hits at Holloman Air Force Base of three objects in their airspace, separate but similar to what was on radar at Stallion Gate. However, they noted that they could not discuss that any further to save their witnesses. They didn't want to jeopardize their witnesses' jobs by discussing that further. But that was noted in the APRO bulletins, and it was noted also in several of the Renzen's books. They have several publications where they discuss the Holloman landing, and they have noted in there that it was on Holloman's radar. And it was on their radar at 5:45 in the morning of Thursday, April 30th. On the west side of Holloman, what is known as North Ramp, there were multiple eyewitness accounts of three objects hovering above the tarmac. This was all recorded by helicopter and ground photography crews. Now, Holloman had a full-time staff of a photography crews, helicopter and ground crews. They worked in tandem with Wismar. Wismar had the missile launches and the testing. Holloman recorded those because Holloman had the photographic capabilities to develop all that film. Digital recording wasn't really a thing in the 60s. You still had film that had to be developed and processed in a dark room. And that had to be done daily and, if not instantaneously for their testing capabilities at that facility. It was mainly a missile testing facility and it was a joint base with White Sands. Now, the witnesses at Holloman also described what was called a white egg or bathtub shaped craft. There were three of them. One was wobbling, and the one that wobbled landed on the tarmac. The other two flew off. The object that landed had three occupants leave it. One was carrying a staff, which was identified later as a translator. They were taken to the building King 1. King 1 is the security forces station between the two bases. If you're coming down Hale Road through White Sands into Holloman Base proper, you must go through King 1 for a security check. And that's where the occupants of the craft were taken to. While at King 1, the base commander and chief scientist met the occupants. They all communicated with each other using this staff. At that time, the occupants were taken to building 930, which was nearby, and the craft was also taken to a nearby building, 830. Building 830 is in a restricted area. The object in 830 was unloaded, and this is pretty much where the event ends. So I wanted to give you a map overview. On the left-hand side, please take a look to the top. You'll see a blue dot. That is where Stallion Gate is. There's a road right above that, which is Route 380. It's on the north end of the base, and it is 90 miles from Holloman. 90 miles. So this had to be two separate objects. It could not be the same object because they were 90 miles apart at the same time, on or about the same time, I should say, maybe. I want you to see those yellow lines that are right below it are the base entrances from Route 54 or White Sands. That's how you get onto White Sands Missile Range from those two yellow locations that you see there. And then going down further, you're going to see two red arrows. The first one is King 1, which is the Security Forces Guard Shack, and Building 930 is right below it. Now that area around Building 930, I blew it up. The map on the right-hand side is showing the detail. At the top, you'll see a little arrow that says 2021 and a blue sticky note. That is the Afghan camp that was on Holloman Air Force Base in 2021. Well, I wanted to just show it as a proximity so you could see it. The road, I have red arrows going all along Hale Road, which is coming south down from Wismer into Holloman proper. The first red square you see is King 1. The airstrip that you see there is what's known as North Ramp. There's the North Ramp area. Right now, it's primarily used as a maintenance or it's kind of an off-ramp facility. It's not the main ramp that the F-16s fly in and out of. It's kind of an off-ramp facility. And that yellow arrow that you see there, that's a little utility road. If objects come in on the north ramp, they're unloaded. Usually it's equipment, large, bulky items. We'll see the C-130s come in on north ramp that have large stuff. But brought down on that utility road, that yellow arrow, that's where the craft was taken to building 830. So it was brought down off that utility road and tucked right in there to building 830, which is in a restricted area. However, the occupants were back at King 1. They met the commander and the chief scientist there. They were taken down the road you see there, which is called, excuse me, that is Hale Road. The road at the top is Kelly Road. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to mess that up. Hale Road is the small road. It's called Hale Road now, but originally it was called Mars Street. Mars, M-A-R-S. And then you see the little arrow going to the building with the red square. That is building 930, where the occupants ended up at. I want to talk a little more about building 830, where the craft was taken to. There's evidence, there's multiple but different places of evidence where this is noted. Most notably to us, there was a Mufon case, 55261. And that Mufon case involved an airman who was stationed at Holloman in the early 60s. That airman says he drove an officer to a UFO that had landed on base. He stayed there while his leadership went to the craft, but he watched the craft be unloaded. That is Mufon case again, 55261. That was filed in 2019. APRO had received a tip. APRO received a tip from the Alamogordo Daily News. Their editor had a witness at a men's store on New York Avenue in Alamogordo. Witnesses at the men's store said that there was an airman in the store bragging about guarding a hangar on Holloman that had a UFO in it. He was a security forces airman and he was guarding this hangar. Now, Carl Lorenzen received that tip from the Alamogordo Daily News the first week of May 1964. So, and also, lastly, we have Steven Spielberg's movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That is a movie where a UFO has landed on an Air Force base and is unloaded. And it is well known that that movie is the story of the Holloman Landing. And I'm going to talk a little more about the movies right now. There were several. There were several movies. You know, even though APRO had reports of a craft in Holloman airspace, they couldn't endanger their witnesses by reporting about it. But they could talk about the WSMR landing. But the two movies that we're going to talk about are from the 70s, first off. The first movie was from 1974. It was called UFOs Past, Present, and Future. It was a made for TV movie, and I have frames from that movie depicted on the left hand side of this screen. That movie was written by Robert Emenegger. Now, he was approached by the DoD to produce a movie that would help the public understand the disclosure of the UFOs. The government was going to disclose UFOs, and they wanted this made for TV movie to be published out there. They gave Emenegger just a few guidelines that he had to follow. One, they didn't want anyone to be scared, so they wanted it presented in a pleasant way that would be palatable to the public. They also wanted the occupants or the crafts themselves to appear as friendly. They wanted them to appear friendly, and most importantly, they wanted our government to be depicted as being in charge of the situation so no one would need to panic. Now, in order to do this, they offered Robert Emenegger original footage of a UFO landing on an Air Force base in the desert. They told him that they had footage from Holloman Air Force Base that he could use in his presentation, and they would like him to use it as the grand finale to prove that this really happened. So Emenegger was given carte blanche to go to any military base he wanted, record anything he wanted to prove this story as being true, and to explain the situation so that people would not panic. So the problem with this well, the first thing is that he viewed the film. The actual footage itself was at Norton Air Force Base in California, and writer Robert Emenegger, he was also the producer, and another producer, Alan Sandler, went to Norton Air Force Base and viewed the actual Holloman footage. The gentleman that showed it to him, he worked there. He was in charge of the security and the film library. His name was Alan Shartle. Paul Shartle. Paul Shartle also viewed the film with Alan Sandler and Robert Emenegger. He reported that on he was interviewed in a 1988 TV show and he talked about it. He also did an interview with cinematographer James Fox where he discussed it. He said that they were both present while he showed them the film. There's also some notations in Jacques Vallée and Dr. J. Allen Hynek's notes that they also were there and viewed the film at that time, but I couldn't find any evidence to back that up. But I did have evidence that Emenegger, Sandler, and Shartle all saw the film. Well, when it came to the end of the documentary, of course, the DoD didn't allow them to have the original footage. Um, they pulled it out at the last minute. So the images that you see are storyboards that were made from memory. Eminager and Sandler viewing the film at Norton. The first image you see at the top is what the occupant looked like and the depiction of his staff, communicator staff. And at the bottom, you see the depiction of the occupants leaving the craft onto the base and speaking with the base commander and the chief scientist. And those two are called out specifically in the movie as being communicated with. And they look like they're having a friendly, conversation there. On the right-hand side, I have images from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was the Steven Spielberg movie from, I believe it was 1977. Now, you can see the difference between the occupant of the craft, how different they look. You look on the left-hand side, those occupants were described as having cat eyes, big noses, dreadlocks. Also, their color was described, it's not shown very well here, but it was described as a blue-gray color. The occupant on the right-hand side is Steven Spielberg, and he looks a little more like the common gray that we all hear so much about these days. So the occupants on the Steven Spielberg movie are a little more like what we're accustomed to. Also at the bottom, you see Spielberg's depiction of the craft landing. A little landing apparatus comes down, and occupants of that craft come out. Also, some animals and people who have been abducted over the years, they come walking out of there. These little aliens come out, and then some military personnel into the craft. So that exchange is shown in the Close Encounters movie. That movie, Close Encounters, is also mainly the Holloman Landing, but also the 1966 Michigan swamp gas event is depicted in there. Another thing that both of these movies have in common is that Dr. Jacques Vallée was the consultant on both of these films, when they were made in the 70s, Jacques Vallée was their consultant. In Close Encounters, Dr. Alan Hynek was also the consultant. In that bottom depiction there of Holloman unlanding that thing, Dr. J. Allen Hynek is actually one of those little scientists you see underneath the craft there. He had a brief cameo in the movie. And also, Dr. Lacombe, the French investigator that's all through Close Encounters, that's Dr. Jacques Vallée in real life. So he had a very prominent part in that movie and in also the making of both of these features. But there was a third film. Yeah, last year there was a film, The Age of Disclosure. It was written by Dan Farah. And it featured some testimony from Dr. Eric Davis, Dr. Hal Puthoff, and Gary Nolan, myriad of other former and current government officials, and they were openly discussing the government's crash retrieval program that the government says they don't have. More importantly, they they verified a quote from President George Bush. Now, we had first heard this quote from President Bush from what was known as the Wilson Davis memo. That came out in 2002. The Wilson Davis memo stated that President Bush said the Holloman landing was real and the security was obscene. Now, that was supposedly a quote that was given to Dr. Eric Davis, but Dr. Davis denied having anything to do with that quote. He denied it for years and years and years. When asked about it, he would say it was classified, he couldn't discuss anything, blah, blah, blah. But last year, for some reason, the classification was off, and he was allowed to openly discuss it. So, for whatever reason, whether it was his non-disclosure was no longer in use and he could talk about it, or maybe the incident has been declassified and that's why everyone can talk about it openly. So in the book, in the movie, The Age of Disclosure, Dr. Eric Davis says that President George Bush told him he was briefed on the Holloman landing when he was the CIA director during the Ford administration. Bush was briefed actually in error as he was preparing for that job. The CIA team members gave him an update on the Holloman landing, not knowing he had never been briefed on the event prior. But they brought him up to speed on it, told him about it, and President Bush was discussing it with Dr. Eric Davis. He took notes on this during a meeting with Admiral Wilson and astronaut Mitchell. That's when Dr. Davis made these notes, and the notes that he made regarding this, that in President Bush said that in April of 1964, three objects hovered above Holloman and one landed on the tarmac. An alien came out of the craft and communicated with the base officials and CIA contacts. Now, like I said, the CIA contacts, that's the first I heard that there was any CIA involved, but that would explain why a CIA briefing discussed the Holloman landing. But like I said, until last year, Dr. Davis had said and did not speak about this, and now he's talking about it openly, and other people are starting to talk more and more about it. Now here's another map that I found. This is a very old map that I got on eBay, and it is prior to 1972. How I know this, you see this black rectangle on the left-hand side, there's nothing there. And currently, there's something there called Bear Base. Bear Base came to Holloman in 1972. So the fact that this map has nothing there tells me that this map was also made prior to 1972. I wanted to show that map because it shows how desolate and vacant that area of the base is. The orange star that you see is the area where the craft landed. That intersection right there is King 1. Coming down the street, you'll see a yellow star. That is building 930. So I just wanted you to see, anyone who knows Holloman these days knows that this area is packed, absolutely packed with utilities and hangars and activity in this area. But in 1964, it was pretty desolate. The only thing out there was, building 930 and the security forces gate. You'll see a big red arrow that I have pointing there. It's a little hard to see, but it's pointing to a red building. That is building 830. That is where the craft was taken to. Now I have a quote that I want to say, and it's from Jacques Vallée's book Revelations. It was published in 1991. And remember, Dr. Vallée was the consultant on both of those 1970s movies, but he wrote a book about it in 1991. And it says the occupants were taken via King 1 to building 930, which is off the west ramp of the flight line. He also stated it in his book Forbidden Science, Volume 2, which was published in 1996. He states again, three occupants had come out of the object and were taken to building 930 on Mars Avenue. So this is how MUFON gets involved in all of this. I'm going to discuss the affidavit that MUFON received here in Alamogordo in 2019. I wanted to tell you just how we received it. That day in April 2019, MUFON was having our our semi-annual chapter meeting. In spring, we had chapter meetings in Alamogordo. In fall, we have them in Roswell. 2019, we were having a MUFON case about, we were having a MUFON discussion regarding the case 55261, where the personnel who was stationed at Holloman in the early 60s drove his leadership out to a landed UFO and watched it be unloaded. That was the topic of the meeting that day. And our state director at the time was Don Burleson, and he gave an excellent presentation regarding that MUFON case and how he felt that it directly went into the APRO information, and it just made the whole case of April April 30th, 1964 as being the date. It was a very strong case. When he was done, he just asked, "Hey, does anyone in the audience have anything they would like to add to this?" And that is where this all gets rolling. A gentleman stood up in the audience and he said, "Yeah, I have something I'd like to add. I am the son of the base commander who was the base commander when the UFO landed on Holloman." And his father told him all about it. He proceeded to tell us more about that event with his father. He told us that his father's name was Colonel Henry Godman. They called him Colonel Hank Godman. And he told us that his father was very sick in 1995. Colonel Godman had cancer and he was very ill with it. And Lou Godman was the son's name. Lou would drive him around Holloman because that would cheer his father up. His father would point to buildings and he would tell his son, what he used to do in that building and that. It really would cheer him up during his illness. Well, one day when they were driving, he asked his son to stop the car and he pointed to the building that was the Mars Shack. He identified it as the Mars Shack, and he said that is where the General and Dr. Steinhoff visited with the aliens that time. Now, Lou said that his father never discussed space business with them, and it was quite a shock for him to hear him say anything about aliens, especially. His father never spoke about anything like that. Also on this document, because Lou had an affidavit in his hand, he had a notarized document in his hand regarding this whole event. But part of this document are memories from Lou's childhood, because he was 4 or 5 when they lived on base. And he remembers as a child the red emergency phone ringing, the emergency phone, red one he wasn't supposed to touch. Rang in the middle of the night. His father got up, left the building hurriedly, and when he came back the next day, Lou overheard him telling, I'm going to assume he was telling his mother, that the reason he left is because security forces had called him that a UFO had landed on base. After Lou's father had told him about what happened in the Mars shack, his childhood memory of that phone ringing came back to him, and he thought that maybe these two events were the same event and they were related to each other. Now, Colonel Hank Godman is an American hero. He was a fighter pilot in World War II, and he was General Douglas MacArthur's private pilot. He retired after 29 years in the Air Force. He retired while he was at Holloman, and his family stayed in Alamogordo. I found a newspaper article in microfiche at the Alamogordo Library. The town of Alamogordo threw Colonel Godman one big retirement party. They had it at the Civic Center downtown, and the mayor and all the dignitaries, the governor, both state senators, the state representatives, dignitaries from Washington, D.C., they all flew in to honor Colonel Godman. He was a really big deal, and it was a wonderful party that the town gave for him. But as I was vetting this evidence, I couldn't find a reference of Colonel Henry Godman serving at Holloman. The only place I could find it was a notation in that newspaper that they had a party for him. So why is Colonel Godman not listed as being a commander at Holloman? He isn't listed on their website. If you go to Holloman's website, they have a past commanders list. Henry Godman's not on that list. If you go to the wing building, big wing building, they have a beautiful mural on the wall. Our Sacramento Mountains are painted there with the base at its feet. All the aircraft that ever flew at Holloman are painted on that mural. And also, there's a timeline of all the commanders from 1945, when the base's inception, when it was the Alamogordo Gunnery Range. From then forward, every commander has a line on that wall with his dates of service at Holloman, except Colonel Henry Godman. On the base, they name the roads, the buildings, the conference rooms, parks, and gardens. They name them after past commanders and people in Holloman's history, but nothing is named after Colonel Henry Godman. And I thought this was really strange and odd. I continued because I had to find evidence that he was a commander at Holloman, and I was able to find it because Colonel Godman had written a book. The book was called The Supreme Commander. And in that, I believe it's chapter 8, he talks about his time at Holloman and how he loved Holloman Air Force Base. And in his book is this picture. This picture was taken on his last day of service at Holloman Air Force Base, and I was really overjoyed to find that. He's listed in the book as having served at Holloman from July of 1963 to July of 1965. Also, last year I had every year, every April, I talk about the Holloman Landing. Last year, a member in the audience sent me an email with a PDF attachment, and that PDF attachment was the 1964 Holloman Yearbook. I was overjoyed to get that too, because in it, when you open it up, there's a full page and it says Our Commander, Colonel Henry Godman. It's wonderful to see that in the yearbook. And I was also able to verify that Dr. Steinhoff was in that book as the chief scientist. Now, he was much easier to identify as working at Holloman. There's also a garden named after Dr. Steinhoff. It's right next to the Officers Club. Dr. Steinhoff was at Holloman from 1957 until 1982. He was one of the German scientists from Project Paperclip. Originally, he was stationed at Fort Bliss at White Sands with the Army with Werner von Braun. They worked on the V-2s, and then they moved on to NASA when NASA started over in Alabama. But Dr. Steinhoff, he came back to Alamogordo, and he got a job at Holloman as a GS employee in 1957 as the chief scientist. He and his family, they liked the area and they wanted to come back to Alamogordo. So he worked at Holloman until 82 and he died in 1984. I believe he still has a son and daughter in the area. I tried to verify some of his data with them, but they weren't having it. So I'm going to go over the affidavit one more time. And in it, it states that when they drove by the Mars shack, Colonel Godman pointed to the shack and said to his son, "This is where the General and Dr. Steinhoff visited with the aliens that time." In Jacques Vallée's book Forbidden Science 2, he states 3 occupants came out of the craft and were taken to Building 930 at the end of Mars Street, where they remained for 2 or 3 years, allegedly helping the United States decode space messages from other alien civilizations. Now, how do I know that building 930 that Jack Belay references is the Mars shack that Colonel Godman identified? And just what does MARS stand for? MARS. It stands for Military Auxiliary Radio Station. Every base had a MARS station in it. It was radio communication they could use in the case of emergencies when the landlines went down. Remember back then, we didn't have digital, we didn't have satellites. So your phone lines were actual physical lines, but in the case of natural disasters, sometimes they got wiped out. Also, um, they offered the Mars station to military enlisted to call home. At that time, long distance calling was extremely, expensive. Imagine your family lives in the States and you get sent to Korea or to Europe and you just want to call home. Long distance charges were very, very absorbent in those days, and the Mars station was a place where a military member could go to and phone home without any charges. So it was a very well known location on base, but through the years it became obsolete with the advent of cell phones. Everybody has, you know, cell phone calling, and there's no long distance charges for that. Also, satellite transmissions came out, and the landlines went away. So the Mars Shack quickly became obsolete when that happened, and those buildings were used for other things. But I, was trying to find the actual location of the Mars station. I wanted to be able to identify the Mars station, and Building 930 is the exact same thing, but I had to find proof that they were the same thing, and I got that in 2023. Someone that I worked with who was in civil engineering, he did he did what are called maintenance requests and whatnot, and he told me that he told me that first of all that Building 930 was the old Mars station. He knew that to be true. He was an old time ham radio operator, also, is kind of how we got talking about the subject. And he also told me, though, that he had the Mars shack torn down. His quote was, he had it torn down and a pile of rocks put on top of it that can't be moved for 100 years. Now, I was overjoyed to find out that confirmation that they were the same, one and the same. But I wrote down the strange quote that he made because I thought it was very odd, and I'm investigating more to find out exactly what that means by a pile of rocks that can't be moved for 100 years. But the fact that he verified that Building 930 and the Mars Shack were the same thing just was great. I remember that day. At the end of my shift, I jumped in my car and I drove over there because I wanted to see with my own eyes. I wanted to see for myself, just where the Mars Shack was, because I wanted to be able to prove that in Colonel Godman's statement, when they were driving around base, he could stop, point to the building, and identify it. So I wanted to be able to do that myself before I verified that as a true statement. Also, I was able to come, come into contact with this photograph that you see here on the right hand side, which is the Mars station, clearly marked as the Mars station. That's not my handwriting. I wanted everyone to see the building because in Jacques Vallée's statement in his book, he said that the occupants of that craft were taken to Building 930 and stayed there for 2 or 3 years. There's a lot of, let's just say, rumor and innuendo that there's an underground base underneath that building, and that's where the aliens stayed. I want everyone to look at the underside of that building, and you can see that there is no basement, there's no elevator shaft, there's no room underneath that station that occupants would have been taken to. And it's a very small building, not something that you would live in for 2 or 3 years. Uh, You move on to the next slide. I'll prove that a little more. Here's a Google Map image. You can see the shape of that building clearly marked in that top image from Google Maps. The Mars station is clearly just a trailer. It's a portable trailer. It has a little bump out on it. If you look at that, you see the steps going up to it. It's clearly, when you look at it from overview in Google Maps, you can see the outline of that building, including the bump out. Very clear. You can also clearly see that telephone pole that's in the picture, and it's also in the Google Maps image. Around the building, you can see the perimeter fence. That's a 20-foot high perimeter fence with 3 rows of barbed wire that ran across the front of it. At that time, you can see when you pull up to it that there's a gate that's blocking the road. So you needed clearance to get into that facility. In the image at the bottom that I have it marked as with a number 2 on it. That's the current. If you Google map it right now, that's what that looks like in that area right now. You can see that just as my contact at CE said, the building's gone. The building is gone. I drove in there because you can see that the gates are wide open now. This isn't a restricted area. No one is forbidden from going in there. It's just another abandoned site on the base. I drove in there because I wanted to see if I was in the camp believing that there was an underground facility underneath that building, and I went looking for it, but there was no any signs whatsoever that there was an underground facility that would have been in that area. And actually, right now, if you were to drive there, there is a pile of rocks, a whole lot of rocks that are in that area. The fence is still up, and it is just covered in rocks. So I really strongly feel that the eyewitness testimony from not only Jacques Ballet's notations of it, but also the eyewitness testimony from Colonel Godman, the base commander, supports the claim that a craft also landed on Holloman on April 30th, 1964, and he identified the building that the occupants of that craft were taken to, and it matches the evidence anyone else that had discussed the event or the movies that had been made about it. It all that data matches up. But we also have some more evidence, just a few other points I want to touch on. The document that Mr. Lou Godman brought to the library that day, it's a notarized personal conversation. Now, in that conversation, there's some data that was between a radio host had a local UFO program in Alamogordo, and he was talking to the son of the chief scientist. He was talking to Dr. Steinhoff's son, and the transcript from that conversation is in this affidavit. Now, I've been asked not to disclose their names, and I won't disclose their names, but they were schoolhood friends and they knew Lou Godman. They knew that Lou Godman's father had been the base commander. Now, the conversation went that the chief scientist's son had received a phone call from a psychiatrist in California. The psychiatrist wanted to know if the chief scientist was available. He had a question he needed to ask him, but Dr. Steinhoff had died in 1984. And oh, actually, this affidavit that I keep talking about, it's dated July 27th, 2011. So this conversation had happened prior to that, and the psychiatrist called the chief scientist's house looking for him, and he was told he had passed. And so he asked the chief scientist's son, he said, "Did your father ever discuss an incident at Holloman? I have a patient who has severe trauma regarding something that he witnessed when he was stationed at Holloman in the early 60s. He's trying to get over that trauma, but I need to know if this event could have possibly happened, and he proceeded to tell him that his patient told him that a UFO landed on base and Colonel Godman walked out to it and communicated with the aliens who had come out of the craft. The whole event was being recorded by base photographers, and the chief scientist was there, and he was somehow involved in the event. Now, the California psychiatrist was quickly told that the chief scientist never discussed his work at home. That was forbidden. So he had nothing that he could add to the conversation, and there was nothing he could tell him that would help his patient. So the conversation ended up between the radio show host and the scientist's son because they wanted he wanted to know if Lou Godman ever talked to the radio show guy about what happened at Holloman. It was a UFO event and wanted to know if it had been discussed on the radio show, and it hadn't. But that's how the conversation started. I interviewed both Lou Godman and the radio show host, and I asked them why would you have your conversation notarized? It seemed odd to me that you had your conversation notarized. What would bring you to do that? And it wasn't Lou Godman's idea, it was the radio show host's idea. He said that he thought that this was a very important event in history and he wanted to notarize it and get it right. Now, he's never shown this information anywhere before. MUFON was the first place to get a copy of it. And I was really grateful. So, so I showed you all my evidence. I showed you the vetting of my evidence. So did I prove it? That those 1964 APRO bulletins with both Jim and Carl Lorenzen's contact discussing a landing on Wismar, did I prove that point? That there was an object that landed on Wismar that morning, and yet again, there was another object that landed on Holloman, and all the evidence that pointed to that. Also, the one at Holloman, there was evidence regarding Colonel Godman's evidence. The three occupants left that craft and communicated and were taken to building 930. This was depicted in two films, and it was talked about by President Bush. It was talked about by President Bush that he was briefed on it when he was the CIA director. I think that I shown more than enough evidence to support all of those claims. And that also that this event happened in April of 1964. I think the APRO bulletins really solidify the date of April 30th, 1964 as being the actual date of the Holloman landing.
So should you believe me? Look, I did my homework on this one. This was not a MUFON case, but if it was a MUFON case, I would have had a final determination of UAV, unidentified aerial vehicle. That's how I would have ended this if this was an actual MUFON case. But I want to share with you today my opinion. My opinion that I wasn't able to prove this by vetting the evidence, but I'm still working on it. And in my opinion, when it discusses that there are three objects in Holloman airspace, one of the objects wobbled, landed on the tarmac, and the other two objects flew away. It's I am in the opinion that one of those objects that flew away is the object that was described to APRO as landing at Wismar that day. I think that one of the objects was actually had landed up at Wismar. The timing, I've been saying 5:45 a.m. because that's the time that I've seen most discussed as being the time of the event, but I've also seen 5:20 a.m. of April 30th, 1964 as being the time of the event. So I believe that the timing is close enough that there was two separate events and the object that landed up at Stallion Gate was one of the ones that flew off from Holloman. So, hey, I spent a lot of time vetting this evidence. I spent a great bit of time up in Rio Rancho at the National UFO Historical Records Center with David Marler. He was very, very helpful and hospitable to us. But I also spent a lot of time over at New Mexico University. New Mexico University in Las Cruces, New Mexico, in the Rio Grande Library, has the personal records of Dr. Ernst Steinhoff. His family donated 90 boxes of unscanned documents. They're all loose. They're in quite a bit of disarray, and I work my way through the boxes one by one. I would like to find some evidence within his documents that supports this event is happening, knowing very well that if there was any, it's probably been removed by now, much like my APRO file from David Marler's facility up at Rio Rancho. But I think that someday I may be able to find some documentation in there to support the claim with his. But I still think there is more than enough evidence to support the claim that April 30th, 1964 was the date of the Holloman landing. If we could just get our hands on that original footage, we really would have the smoking gun needed to prove it. And if you have any questions or observations that you would like to discuss with me, I can be reached at nm.mufon@gmail.com. That's nm.mufon at gmail.com. I know an awful lot about the Holloman Landing, and I'd be able to answer your questions. You can also visit New Mexico MUFON on our Facebook page, and I also record these programs and I put them on YouTube. I apologize ahead of time for the sound. My microphone is not the greatest. Also, just to reiterate, I am going to be at the UFO Festival in Roswell this year. I'll be in the lobby of the UFO Museum July 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Please stop by and say hi. I'd love to see you. We're going to be discussing the Holloman landing there. I'll have some information with me, and I'll also have some membership stuff from MUFON. I was recently on a podcast. Chris Jordan's Curious Realms discuss the Holloman landing with them. I want to thank him again for his time and his hospitality. We have a few other things happening. MUFON is expanding into Las Cruces, New Mexico. I will be at the Thomas Brannigan Memorial Library Saturday, May 2nd at 11 a.m. I'll be up in the Roadrunner room. I'll be presenting the Holloman landing. We're finally expanding our program into Las Cruces. I will always continue with the Alamogordo meeting because I live in Alamogordo. I will always have the Alamogordo meeting, but we are able, due to heavy attendance, to expand into Las Cruces. Very happy about that. Next month in Alamogordo, I'm going to have a guest speaker, Mr. Lynn Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan lives in Alamogordo, and he is gracious enough to come over and speak to our group. He's going to tell us about he had a recent podcast at Marcus Aubrey's called Prepare Yourself for What's Coming. He's going to talk to us a little more about that and just what that means to us here in New Mexico. We really appreciate the time that Mr. Buchanan gives us at our facility. So next meeting is going to be May 16th in Alamogordo at 11 a.m. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate your support of MUFON and Coffee Cups and Flying Saucers.